morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to the MIT System Design and Management Program's Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Lois Slavin. I'm the Communications Director for SDM, and I'm here with our technical guru, Stephen DeRocher, and our speaker, Professor Richard de Neufville. Professor de Neufville will be speaking today on a systems approach to airport planning, design, and management. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the professor's presentation. However, we ask that as questions arise, if you could kindly type them directly into the chat section addressed to everyone, that would be great. And with that, I turn it over to Professor de Neufville.
It's not advancing for some reason. Excuse me, everyone. There we go. Whatever. All right, now. So welcome to the MIT webinar, organized by the System Design and Management Program, which is a Master Science program for experienced design professionals here at MIT. The outline today is, first of all, I want to talk about sort of the notion of airport systems planning for the airport airline industry, and cover several issues. And the issues are basically that this is a field where they are not doing system design very much, and it's crying for your attention. So in particular, they're not planning for airports as systems, they're not designing them individual airports as systems, and they're not managing the processes efficiently, especially regard to queuing behavior and space sharing. This is basically a field in need of a rethink, which is part of what my colleagues and I have been trying to do. So the agenda item, first of all, refers to airport systems planning. Up there on the upper right-hand side, you have a picture of the book, and it's not so much the cover as it's actually quite thick. It's a wonderful book. Keep your door open. It's a real door stopper, but it's trying to cover everything you want to know about airports and more. So this particular one is a new text, in that it's the second edition, just came out in May. And it's new because it's about 50% rewritten from the original text of 10 years ago, and a lot has changed in the last decade. It's amazing how fast this field has been moving. What's new in particular is there is airline and airport privatization is now a fact worldwide. This changes the game differently because the airlines now tend to compete on commercial bases rather than extension of the flying the flag, whether it's Britain or Japan or France. And also the airports tend to have a completely different perspective when they run as businesses rather than government departments. There is also an enormous amount of recent research that's come out from the United States Airport Cooperative Research Program, and we cover also in the text new chapters on airline needs, the environment, and notice there's great turmoil and uncertainty in the markets. This whole airline industry is changing very, very quickly. And therefore, there's an emphasis on flexibility in design because we have to be able to have an agile adaptation to what is actually coming along, which was not the experience in the past. So the emphasis now of the book itself, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, is on the systems perspective. First of all, among airports, it's now the case that airports compete globally with each other. So, for example, London competes with Dubai for the traffic going from North America to, say, India or Southeast Asia. You can either change in London to go somewhere, or you can change in Dubai. This is competition between these cities several thousand miles apart was not practice before. Also, there are competitions on the airport. We need to think about how the pieces fit together, and this is where we need some systems thinking, because typically the plans, people have been planning projects individually and independently. And then in detail, we need to think about projects over time, as each project is part of a portfolio of possible projects. Now, there's something about the title I'd like to bring out because it's indicative of the approach. It is Airport Systems Planning, Design, and Management. It's integrated. This is different from the usual thought where it's airport engineering, that's one kind of text, or airport management talks about them separately. But really, you want to think about all these pieces together. So design is an extension of planning that you would like to, if you do a design right, you enable a range of possible choices. What you do not do is to design something for one purpose only or with limited capabilities, and then you are stuck with a solution which doesn't work very well for the past, for the future, although it worked in the past. So an example of that is Boston's own International Terminal, which does cater to international traffic and also to national domestic traffic, and it has a somewhat of a confused persona at various times. Equivalently, the management, the design should be closely linked. That is, the capacity of a facility depends on how it is managed. So, for example, good management will reduce the time people have to stay in particular facilities and will therefore require less space, and it will save on construction and operations in many ways. So there are various good and bad examples of that. Singapore is excellent, some others are not. We can discuss those in the Q&A period. I'd be glad to respond to questions, actually respond to questions not only today, but if we run out of time for your questions, to respond to them offline as you can approach me directly. I'd also like to notice that we focus in the text, my colleagues and I, on not airports alone. That's the traditional approach, with the that was based upon the idea that airlines change their routes slowly, that airlines don't influence the traffic, and all you had to do is to worry about the airports. The fact is that the world has changed. Airlines are now relatively free to fly where and what they want to do. There are open skies agreements. There are alliances between airlines that make multiple airlines act together. There are low-cost airlines. So airlines really influence what's happening in the airports. So, for example, Delta has recently quit Cincinnati as an airport. US Air abandoned its hub in Pittsburgh. TWA folded and has left St. Louis. And what we need is to not think just about the airports, but we need to focus on the airport airline industry. That is, think of it again as a system, but not just as a physical system, but as the arrangements between the users seen globally, or at least internationally, not just on a particular airport. Let me now mention also the U.S. Airport Cooperative Research Program. It's almost 10 years old now, and it is an industry-driven applied research program, and it develops a lot of practical solutions for airport operators. Now that it started, it's issuing about 20 reports a year, and it has done some very good work. On the screen, there is a citation, and as this is recorded, you can look it up later on, or just remember it, that it exists. You can get all these reports directly from off the web, and they're free for distribution. A particular one that I like is this one here on addressing uncertainty about future airport activity levels, and it is one of the really innovative kind of reports that's available that I recommend to you. And in general, it has a lot of useful material and is setting the tone for current thinking. In terms of the new chapters, one of the things chapters we have is by our colleague Dr. Peter Belobaba from the MIT Aeronautics and Astronautics Department, and he is focusing on how the airlines are affecting the airports themselves. So one of the aspects is that you have trends in fleets to, surprisingly, as compared to people thinking about it earlier, you have the trends to smaller kind of large wide-body aircraft, the Dreamliner, for example, as opposed to the very large A380, very large aircraft. And this is so the airlines can offer frequency of services to more destinations. You now have a worldwide acceptance that connecting hubs is the central model for how airlines are going to be operating their networks. This has changed a lot. It deals also with the importance of frequency in the scheduling procedure and how that drives, in fact, the choice of smaller aircraft, where allowing the airlines to compete on frequency of service to various destinations. Big change in the operations in terms of faster turnaround times for aircraft, which means that you need fewer gates. You get the airlines in the air more, earning money rather than sitting on the ground, and changes the design of the airport passenger buildings and terminals. And, of course, you have a lot of consolidations and development of mega carriers that influencing the costs and reducing the costs all over in real terms. And all these changes means that flexibility is a crucial aspect of system design for airports. Another chapter that's new is by our colleague Tom Reynolds, who's at the Lincoln Lab these days. And the interesting aspects is that the focus has changed a lot. On the one hand, we now think about noise reduction in terms of having the aircraft operate in particularly different ways than they had before, is to reduce the noise as they land and also as they take off in terms of their flight paths. A lot of emphasis now on air quality and the kind of things you can do at the airport to reduce de-icing fluid and oil spills and things of that sort. And the concern also greatly about climate change, because one of the features of airports is they're typically located in formerly flat areas, and coastal areas where things are flat, often in previously marshy areas, as in Washington, for example, or Boston, and sea rise is threatening to a number of airports in the United States and around the world. And in general, there's a shift in emphasis, which is less on noise, which has been a driver in previous years, and more on a variety of other factors that need to be taken into account. Finally, let me emphasize to everybody the airport airline industry is in the middle of absolutely tremendous change. Airline bankruptcies and consolidations are the headliners here. In the United States, since we started deregulation about, 1978 is the date the national legislation was passed, which puts us about 40-some years ago. We are coming, in some ways, to the end of the consolidations. There's very few airlines to merge with anymore. But at the same time, we're having the development of all kinds of low-cost carriers, which are, in fact, driving down the fares and driving the bankruptcies and driving the consolidations and mergers of the major airlines, which we call the legacy airlines very frequently. And on top of that, there are open skies agreements permitting airlines to fly to many different destinations in a country, so that we have all kinds of shifts in route patterns and so forth. So, for example, I mentioned the Dubai as a competitor. The traditional route from Europe, the UK in particular, the United Kingdom, England to Australia was through Singapore, and recently Qantas decided to basically close its base in Singapore and to reroute everything through Dubai and change its pattern of flow. This is the kind of shift that is occurring, and that illustrates the kind of competition there is between airports widely apart in the world. So the routes are really changing, and this can have a big impact on particular airports. So the story here is that we really don't know what is next. Things are changing, and we need to be agile in our thinking, a theme that I've indicated already a couple of times. So the central theme of the book is, in fact, flexibility. The issue is, given all the uncertainty, it's best not to overcommit when the future is unclear. Therefore, we should maintain flexibility to take advantage of new opportunities, and at the same time have insurance in the sense of the ability to avoid bad situations, to avoid downsides. That's in part as an underlying or stressing the idea that we don't want to overcommit and to have left with big facilities that we then can't support because they are inappropriate for the conditions that actually exist. And a lot of this is drawn from the text I wrote with a colleague at Cambridge University, the University of Cambridge nowadays, Stefan Schultes. So now let's think about, in detail, the notion of planning for airports as systems. And the issue here is that we haven't really been planning for them as systems. Now, we can obviously note that airports have quite different functions. They are major transfer hubs on the continental and intercontinental scale, such as Denver, or Dallas-Fort Worth, or Dubai, or Singapore, and others. This is not a whole list. And these airports receive passengers from all over, such as at DFW, at Dallas, and then they come from, say, Japan to Dallas, and they want to go on to New Orleans, or to Houston, or other places, and they get off the plane and change for a final destination. That's very different from the range of what I'll call business destination airports like New York LaGuardia or Washington downtown airport, Washington Reagan Airport, where people basically come in, not all of them of course, but a lot of them come in for the day or a couple of days, they go right out, they're not transferring to any other place. It really serves a very different market. And of course there's a lot of regional and low-cost airlines, for example, Miami, Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale labeled there Miami because it's a Miami region, but it serves a particular traffic, which is generally the low cost and holiday traffic, not the international traffic that flows into Miami from and to Latin America, for example. They have quite different functions. And as you can imagine, these different functions form a kind of hierarchical network. In other fields, we collectively devote a great deal of effort to analyze and design such systems to make sure the pieces work together well. But the fact is, sadly, that no one designs the airport system. This is overall, it's a problem. So, the actual situation, for example, in the United States, we have something called the National Plan for Integrated Airport Systems, NIPIAS, as it's commonly called. But it is really not a plan, and nobody's going to act on. It's an inventory of assets. It lists all the substantive airports in the United States, and indicates what they individually like to do, but it's in no way a plan of what will happen. It's a plan of what various people's wishes might be, and it doesn't judge between them. So we really don't have any kind of national plan in the United States. We used to have such things worldwide because at various countries, the national governments were in fact the airport developers. So Transport Canada played that role in Canada, and there was a similar organization in Australia. But these national roles have been devolved to local authorities. So in Canada, you have independent authorities in Montreal and Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton and so on, which do their own thing, and they're in fact doing a very nice job at their own thing, but it is, again, not a national plan. And the same thing with Australia. In Australia, it's a little bit worse in a certain sense, because whereas in Canada, it's local authorities who are running the airports for the benefits of their communities or provinces. In Australia, a lot of the ownership is in fact international, where the owners of Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane are caring about running a business, but don't particularly care about the future of Australia from a local point of view. What we have, in fact, is a massive global business run at the retail level. Uncoordinated plans by the participants with minor market shares. It's in some ways, it's a mom-and-pop organization of a business. There are no big leaders with significant market shares who are organizing things, who are setting standards, who are investing on research in how to operate and build efficiently. It's a lot of small, relatively small actors worldwide. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because they make errors, both of commission and omission, doing things they shouldn't have and not managing to do things they should do. So, for example, we have in the United States big examples of wasted investments. In Cincinnati, they used to have, as of 8 years ago, 22 million passengers went through Cincinnati. It's now down to 6 million. All the investments that were committed, the long-term investments in buildings that will be there for 20 or so more years, are basically wasted when you are down to basically 25% or maybe 30% of the traffic that you used to have. Same way in St. Louis, it used to have 30 million passengers a decade ago or so. It was down to 12 million and change 10 years later on. And in between, at great effort, not just in terms of money, but in terms of displacing a community, they built a billion-dollar-plus runway, which is hardly used at all. I mean, it is used. I think the latest report has had 5% use of it, but it's sort of in the wrong place and unneeded. And if it weren't there, nobody would miss it. So this is the kind of thing that happens when there isn't a kind of overall view and longer-term national or international perspective. It's not designed as a system. But the errors also can be omission. So, for example, right now, the UK, the English government, is thinking about how it would go about building more airport capacity for the London area, because its airports are, by and large, like Heathrow and Gatwick, are filled to the brim, so to speak. And the sad portion about this is that it is only now that this topic has really been considered, when the capacity is already quite full, and it will take them, if they manage to do it, it'll take them a decade or more to get the planning permissions, the approvals, do the construction and everything, and by that time, the capacity will have been worse, and a lot of the traffic will have been forced to move to other places and not, for example, have as much hubbing operations in the London area as they've been used to. So in terms of competition with Dubai that I mentioned, or indeed with even Frankfurt and Paris, London will be behind. So it's inadequate forward planning at a national or a scale. So what would be desirable? It would be desirable if there were major airport groups that could create coordinated systems of airports with economies of scale. If we could move from an industry which, instead of having sort of small local organizations important to their own, but on a global scale, mom and pop scale, we could have larger entities to do this in a coordinated fashion. So there is one, FedEx, the cargo carrier, if you want, that distributes things, which in fact, by the way, is probably the most valuable and largest airline in the world in terms of aircraft and movements. You don't see it very much because you're not a piece of cargo and you don't fly overnight to Memphis to get sorted out to go somewhere else. But as a shipper, being such a major force, it has established a chain of airport assets built and many largely to its specifications. So it is, in order to run its business, it has created a network of coordinated facilities which it basically owns and operates at various airports. So this is one kind of model that might develop. Another model, which hasn't occurred here anywhere, but it's in some ways a hotel chain model. That is, there's some entity that has coordinated design and management of assets. So you can think about your favorite airline chain, Hyatt, Sheraton, whatever you would like to mention, but they run thousands of properties around the world, or at least 1,000 properties around the world, and have done so in a way to really make sure that their new properties are done with a system design. They have economies of scale, and they don't have to own the properties themselves, but they operate them, and they operate them very efficiently. Whether you like their service or not is another issue, but they certainly are efficient as compared to individual hotels, each trying to do it on their own way. And it could be possible that airport companies such as exist could do such a thing, but we're not there yet in any way. So we haven't developed the Walmart of airports. We haven't developed the company which will be efficient and deliver the services at a much lower prices than the traditional arrangements. So let me move on at this point to this notion of designing individual airports as systems. Again, this is something that is not particularly done. And the observation here is that we're in a business where the design loads on airports are common internationally. Whether you are in Boston or Dallas or Singapore or Dubai, we're using the same kind of aircraft, basically. Boeing or Airbus and maybe some others, Embraer, Bombardier, in smaller airports. The people and bags are pretty much all the same. They are about the same size. The bags are fairly standard. So it's a common kind of load. And you'd expect that if you have facilities with the same kind of loads, you might find out what the efficient solution was and design accordingly. When we talk about runways, these are very standardized. They are by the International Civil Aviation Organization, part of the United Nations, but whether you are in Argentina or Armenia, they're basically designed to the same kind of specifications. There's some marginal differences, but it's a fairly standardized activity, and everybody basically knows the rules. However, when you come to the notion of passenger buildings, which, by the way, collectively, the investment in passenger buildings is generally larger than the investment in the runways themselves these days, or has been for some time. Everything is different. There's no standardization. Everything is custom tailored. There are no real efficiencies. It is a system waiting to have a system design and management. So The traditional approach is that almost every airport building is original. Everything is different. What typically happens for any project is they have some kind of design competition and select an architect, and particularly for the major airport, you have signature architects as internationally famous ones. They vie to see who could have the most fascinating, interesting design, so they can be reported in the architectural magazines, and they are all custom tailored, typically quite expensive because they're one of their kind. People have to learn how to build them, and in this context, there's a lot of attention to roof lines, the kind of thing that you can see when you're in a helicopter hovering over the airfield, but you do not see when you're inside. Or they also love attention to one-of-a-kind custom interiors, but none of it is really focused on efficiency or operations on the short or the long term. They come in all shapes and sizes and interior conveyances. They also favor local suppliers, so they can give local producers of equipment their own chance to be seen. All this is very good, but it means that they are, in effect, reinventing the wheel, and as they're doing it, and they're not typically very experienced in doing airports because they don't do very many of them, they make all kinds of mistakes. So let's just take a look at some of the possibilities that we have here. So this is Denver. Tepees in a plane. Now, actually, it's part of a runway, but they've taken the picture from the site boasting about it to emphasize how it is not an airport, but it's tepees. Because of the various elevations, they're between where this picture is taken and where the building is, which goes for several stories underneath these tents, which is the roof line. There are some runways, but this is to give you an idea of what they are designing for. Tepees on a plane. It's not efficiency of an airport operation. Here's another one coming up when the load's there. This is the Shinkansai Kuko, or the new Kansai Airport for Osaka, built now about 20 years ago. It's designed by Renzo. The image there is bird in flight, and it's nice curved glass roof. It's wonderful. The issue, however, is that we are on an island that's fill, which is consolidating, so there's differential settlement underneath this building. We're also in an earthquake building, so you can imagine what it's like to try to make sure that a glass roof does not bust up in an earthquake area, as there are considerable differences in settlement from one end to the other. Their solution, by the way, is that underneath this glass roof, in the basement, there are huge jacks, I think several hundred of them, I don't know the exact number, where they can raise or compensate for the differential settlement to keep everything trued up. And it's as if you keep sticking matchbooks underneath the legs of the table to keep it level. So, a wonderful picture, not efficient, and one of its kind. Here's another one. This is Norman Foster. The image here was a jewel box. Definitely, when you, at nighttime, when there's lights inside and it's sitting in the middle of the plains of northeast of London, you have a glowing building in there. He was also very proud, the architecture firm was very proud, that all the counters and everything was designed uniquely for this building. There was no other anywhere else in the world like it. Of course, it makes replacement somewhat difficult when you have everything designed particularly for just one small airport, and it's very hard to expand. So that's one inside. Here's another one that his competitor, his British competitor, Richard Rogers' design. This is at Madrid. It's all about the roof. You can see, or mostly you can't see, on the bottom level where your gate is because there's all that stuff going on inside, and it's quite confusing. Just by the way, it's so confusing that they have had, last time that I was there, they had a large number of employees in yellow jackets were giving information because so many people were getting lost that they had to have people to redirect them in various places. It's a wonderful roof, and again, one of its kind, and you can imagine this is expensive construction. So why does all this matter? I mean, the buildings are arguably wonderful, but why does this matter? Well, it matters because it can be extremely costly, because when you do something for the first time, you often make mistakes, and because it's very confusing to the passengers. So, for example, there's no learning. There's, oh, I did it this way once, now I'm doing it a second time, I can do it better. There's no economy of scale, and the structures are difficult to build. So, for example, the Terminal 5 at London, the latest building there, costs $7 billion. Just by comparison, the construction of the entire Denver International Airport was about $3.5 billion. So you can imagine how expensive this is. Mistakes. So Denver itself wanted, again, a unique system. It was an automated baggage system. It delayed the opening of the airport by 15 months. During that time, it cost the airport $30 million a month. This is the interest on the capital that they couldn't recover, and of course, keeping the building warm and clean. And altogether, this innovation cost them about $500 million in round numbers because they wanted to be unique. Also, it leads to incredible passenger confusion. It's not confusion because, well, confusion in part because every time you come to a new airport, you don't have very much to go by because things are all different. It's hard to know what to expect. It's not like going to some facilities where it's the same kind of thing. Most everywhere you know what to expect and find your way around. So just to give you an example, at this airport in Madrid, that I showed you a picture of it, Barajas, I made this count the last time I was there, and I was going from Boston to Bilbao and changing, that in terms of my orientation as my path, I had 14 complete turns in order to get from my first plane to the second. That is, circular staircases, go back and forth, turning around, doubling back. It's no wonder that they had to have nice people standing around orienting people. This is not the only example, though. At Frankfurt, I made a similar calculation or estimate, the kind of thing I do when I go through airports, that coming to it by the suburban train from, well, coming from the suburban train to board an aircraft in Terminal 2, I changed 17 levels. I had to go down underneath the roadway, then up 4 levels to a train between stations, then down to the check-in, then up several levels to the departure level, then down to the runway level from that place, and then up into the plane. All in all, I counted 17. I may have missed one or overcounted one, but these are the kind of thing where it's very confusing. So what could be different? What could be different is to recognize that airport buildings are billion-dollar business investments, that we should develop a layered system architecture as for computer systems to enable standardization, economy of scale, continuous learning, and we need to move from a handcrafted to an industrial design. That is, from going to everything is handcrafted, bespoke tailoring, and one to some kind of common design. Now let me close with some discussion about the management aspect, in particular talking about queuing processes and space sharing. So there are two observations I bring here. One is queues, that there's waiting and congestion everywhere. And the second aspect is, while there's waiting congestion because you're trying to get the service you'd like to have, to check-in, security, gate processing, whatever, much of the airport building is unused most of the time. That's the remarkable thing, that is, a lot of it's not busy while you are in a busy queue. Now, you know what I mean by queues. You've experienced them a lot. I don't have to describe them more. And the other one, though, I draw your attention to, because you don't see it because you're in the busy portion generally, is that what happens at the check-in peaks for the different airlines and services are at different times. So, while one aspect is busy, the one that you're probably in because you're, like most people, going at the busy times, other ones, gates, gate lounges, security checks, are not busy. They're actually quite empty. So you have a lot, at any time, you have a lot of idle facilities in the wrong time and place and so forth. Somehow, the personify quit unexpectedly. So you've missed my pretty face, but I hope you can still see the screen. What's that?
We'll do without it for the remainder.
Okay, you've seen it once. 2 seconds of my face is enough for anybody. But here we go. So let me move on. Why this happens? So let's talk about the queues. So one reason you get in these queues is there's a misunderstanding and poor management coordination. That is, there's first of all, a misunderstanding of capacity. So we can talk about the nominal capacity of what a process can deal with if everything's working very smoothly. However, if we take the ratio of the actual use as compared to the nominal capacity, which traditionally has the symbol of the Greek thing that looks like a P but is rho, what happens is that the delays and unreliability increase exponentially. That although there might be a nominal capacity of 1,000, the realistic capacity may be considerably less. And this is what a lot of designers and operators don't think of. They say, let me just have the right number of servers, whether it's TSA officials or whatever, to meet the average load, but almost by definition you have the wrong number when you do that. So, and why is it part of the management coordination is that you have all those delays in queues, which means that people have less time after the queues or in shopping, and from the airport has less revenues, and it would make a lot of sense for the airports to be able to speed things up so that you could use their services and enjoy them more. But the fact is the various parts of the airport do not, in general, coordinate very well. There are all kinds of institutional reasons for that. It's not that people don't understand the issue, but the fact is the issue is not addressed very successfully in many places. Moreover, for queues, there's also the fact that there's a direct relation between the speed of processing and the space needed. The faster the processing, the less waiting in line, the less space needed. So, if you don't have a queue, you don't have a lot of people lined up, and you don't have to provide a lot of space for them. And what this means also in various places is that now that we have more automated check-ins in terms of people come to the airport with their boarding passes and everything, they don't need to check in, so that the old check-in counters with lots of space in front of them are often empty simply because the process is speeded up and they don't need that space anymore. So good management uses this notion to save on waiting areas. So, for example, in Singapore, they have excellent processing times and they have much smaller waiting areas to reduces the cost besides making things more enjoyable for you. Now, there's also this notion of empty space, that the usual practice is to size each element of the airport building separately. So they say, how much do we need for the lounge space, how much do we need for each storage, how much for corridors, and they add all this up. So there's 1,000 passengers, they have 1,000 space for 1,000 passengers for the gates, for the percentage that uses the stores, and so forth. But any particular person only uses one space at a time, so there's an enormous double counting. Also, the needs arise at different times, so that whereas one aircraft is boarding and it's got a lot of people waiting for it, the next flight across the hall is not boarding yet, and there aren't very many people on it. So there's big opportunities for different functions to share. And depending upon the situation, there's up to 50% savings are possible in many cases compared to what is actually done. So let me now give a good example of airport system design to sort of show the kind of thing that can happen. And this is Terminal 5 at New York Kennedy Airport, a JetBlue terminal. It cost about $750 million, 25 gates, and it had a very extensive system planning, design, and management. There may be something equivalent elsewhere. I don't know of it yet, but this is a very interesting design. So first of all, here's this picture. You may not notice what I immediately notice and what the architects notice, but it's an industrial design. So all those little bumps on the roof there are the air conditioning and other service units, which, viewed from the air, make it look as if it was full of warts. But of course, as you are in it and you're on the runway, you don't see this. But having a flat roof with these facilities up there rather than a fancy curved roof is very much less expensive. So that's one aspect of it. Now here's a plan, and what you might observe is in the light green inside the building, these are lounges, which, for example, looking on the far right-hand side, you have 5 aircraft positioned. They're all sharing the same place. It's an easy thing to imagine. You've seen examples of that in a number of places. But what it means is instead of having 5 times the lounges required for one aircraft, you have about half of what it would otherwise be calculated. It's really common sense, often not done, but done here very nicely. So common lounge areas, and the whole space of this is very efficient. But that's not all. So here is part of their lounge space. You can see the aircraft is about 100 feet from where this picture is taken, and you have these things that look like a business center with computers. What this actually is, it's a restaurant, among other things. That is, you can sit at these, order from, well, you like Papagino's and I want the salad. You can order from different restaurants that are scattered behind you where you can't see them, which you can also be at if you really want to. And the wait person will bring the food right there. So you have a common use of lounge, shared space, business area, and everything all in one place, meaning that it is, in fact, very economical in terms of overall space provided. And when you consider that the space for an airport easily costs something on the order of $1,000 per square foot, in terms of all kitted out, saving, this can lead to a great deal of saving. So here is an airport which is not built on the cheap. You can see this is very nicely equipped, but is in fact very inexpensive in overall terms, especially considering it was built in New York City, where it's expensive to build most anything. So I'd like to close now and leave a chance for questions that might arise. But the whole point is that we can do better. this whole business of airport planning, which my colleagues and I would prefer to call airport systems planning, design, and management, needs a rethink. It needs a systems approach all across the spectrum, and we need to get beyond an excessive fragmentation of the industry. It probably needs some kind of reorganization in many ways. This is obviously going to take time, but our job in some ways is to look ahead to the future and not to be stuck in the past. Thank you very much for your attention for these last minutes.
Thank you, Professor Neufville. We have several minutes for Q&A, and I would like to invite everyone to type your questions directly into the chat section and address them to everyone. We'll give you a few moments to do that, and in the meantime, a shameless promotion for the upcoming MIT STM Systems Thinking Conference, which will be held on October 10th here at MIT. The theme is Big Data, a Systems Approach, and it will focus on going beyond the numbers. We hope you can attend. We will be sending out a promotion. And with that, I again invite you to type your questions directly into the chat section addressed to everyone. Okay, from Ted Grisella, what can be done to salvage deserted resources like the St. Louis airport?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, the people who are doing it there are doing their very best, but basically it was massively overbuilt, as you may know from personal experience, and there's not too many things you can do with a long runway that isn't particularly needed. So the best way to salvage it is not to create the situation where you have it in the first place. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about this is that it was obvious to industry observers that TWA, which was the main operator at St. Louis, was in very difficult situations and was in need of last rites, which it eventually got. And to build a big billion-dollar facility for a tenant that wasn't going to be there was not the best call that you could have done. So they had the opportunity to delay the investment, to scale it back, but no, they had to go ahead, they built it, and now they're left with it. So call it what you want, but the best opportunity to avoid the problem was not to have created it in the first place.
Okay. From one of our SDM 13 fellows, Juan Romu, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, he would like to know if there's an actual project ongoing that is putting in practice some of these ideas.
Well, there isn't particularly a project, but my colleagues at MIT and indeed elsewhere are trying to get people to think about how to do these things much better, are calling attention to things like the JetBlue terminal and works that create such things. In fact, the problem is that old habits die slowly. Architects like to have monuments that they're famous for. The local authorities want to do their own thing, not to have something copied from somewhere else. So it's slow going in many ways, unfortunately. One of the things they say sometimes about science is that it progresses funeral by funeral, that you have to wait until the new generation comes along rather than convert the old generation.
Okay, thank you. From STM alum Doug Haig, who asks, do you have a recommended governance structure for airport management? For example, Charlotte is currently in the courts over how to manage. Should they have a city versus regional authority? Neither seems right, but the main controlling factor is who is on the hook for the bonds.
Well, I can't comment particularly on the Charlotte case because I'm not familiar with it. But one of the things one of the big discussions in the area is goes along the following lines, that airports have been run traditionally by government agencies. Government agencies aren't necessarily known for their efficiency. We need to have private operators. Let's privatize it and transform the airport into private companies. So the big tension is between public ownership or private ownership. And neither of those extremes works particularly well because there is a strong public interest in the operation of an airport. It's vital to the community. You don't want a private operator to operate as a monopolist. And if you have a private operator, you have to have a regulatory structure, and the cases where there's a regulation and a private operator lead to very difficult situations. In fact, in the United States, largely, and it's parallel in Canada but different model, we have a system where there is the community, whether it's the state, as in Boston, or it's a city and elsewhere, the community has an authority which owns the airport, but its individual pieces are basically privatized. So the parking garage may be run by a company, individual airlines will run their airports, FedEx will run its cargo areas, so that you can combine the public ownership of the ground and the private operations, which tend to be more efficient on the various facilities. So that kind of hybrid arrangement tends to be best. I know I haven't solved anything or addressed specifically the question of Charlotte, but I think that whether it's the city or the larger community operating the way they do in the United States, it's probably a pretty good solution compared to the other alternatives.
Great, thank you. We have many more questions, and we'll go as long as Professor de Neufville is available. I'd like to remind you all that Professor de Neufville will be available by email to discuss your questions, so please feel free to enter them even if we don't have time to get to every single one. From James Murphy. Seems like you address the need for efficiency and cost savings, but the desired state of many airports is uniqueness. What are some of the major beneficial goals and objectives that could be the drivers to doing a systems approach rather than turning art-oriented facilities, as you just mentioned, for today's airports into Walmart-type facilities?
One of the things that's happening at airports is that low-cost airlines are to some extent tending to drive the new designs. I say to some extent because it is not widespread, but the fact is that the low-cost airlines, which have always been seen as, or have traditionally been seen as marginal, are now becoming very important. So Southwest Airlines, to give you an example, is now by far the largest carrier of domestic passengers with the United States. So one of the things that airlines such as this do when they're negotiating with airports as to whether they will fly to a place or under what terms they will fly is to insist upon more efficient services. Whoops, the lights just went out, I don't know why, but they come back on. The more efficient services. So in many ways, where I think this will go is they will have cost-conscious airlines basically saying that if you want our business, you will operate in a way that reflects this cost consciousness, and you'll design to our requirements and our standards. And this is the situation, I think, which will be coming to pass. It's not there yet, but I think that will be the driver.
Thank you. How are you doing for time, Professor?
I can do it.
Okay. From Joan Bruno, considering that the traffic forecast conditions the design of the terminal, which design point should be chosen? For example, a 5-year forecast, 10 years, 25 years, etc.
I think the question is, in some ways, a variant on that. That's a very good question. That is, we might want to be thinking about how we would deal with a 25-year forecast should it come about. But that does not mean we have to build it for now. So I could think about saying, right, we will start off with a smaller module of a terminal, and as the need develops, if it develops, we will expand it. Or if the module that we have now is not suited to the kind of aircraft we will have 10 years from now, we can add on to it in the most appropriate way. So I think that we want to we want to align our commitments to what we know, but we also want to plan for the future at the same time. So think long-term, act short-term. And it's basically how do you think about playing a game of chess? You think 10 moves ahead if you can. I can only get to about 3 or 4. But you think moves ahead, but you only act one move at a time. So you mediate between both extremes, I think. You don't build for the 25-year forecast immediately. Thank you.
From Alex Connect, first I want to say thanks to Professor de Neufville for this great presentation. I think it was very enlightening. My question is, don't you think that standardization in terminal building can lead to a loss of flexibility in its everyday operation, drifting designers away from usually needed, uniquely tailored solutions, and thus making it difficult to adapt to their adaptation to future changes on demand?
Well, no, not particularly, because it's sort of like your laptop computer, for example, if you have it. It is designed in a standard way, and one of the things that it's designed with is USB and other ports to allow you to add on all kinds of things if you want. So you can perfectly well have a standard design with the flexibility to accommodate different situations. And at least you can have standardized parts so that you could think about for example, the kinds of horizontal elevators that you see, people movers that you see in many places, are now converging into a couple of major designs so that you have people who repeat the design again and again and makes it much more efficient as compared to what it was before. You can still have standardized basic parts with the flexibility as to what you put together.
Okay. This one's very interesting. They're all very interesting, but this one really piques my interest. It's from Elon Simon. How does flexibility work with the changing requirements of security? This constraint may not be linear in nature in terms of added delays and can be detrimental to the design.
Well, this is one of the things about flexibility, that you want to think not only in terms of increments in size. We might or might not need to double the size of this facility. But you also want to think about game changers that may exist. For example, how things might just be operated very differently. So the way you think about that in some ways is to avoid very hard barriers between various particular elements, so that you can reallocate space. So that, for example, think of spaces which have larger open areas and don't have structural walls in between them. That is, now you can't anticipate every conceivable thing, but you certainly can think about the kinds of things that may happen and ask yourself the question as a designer or as a manager, what would we do if? And if you cannot answer the question to your satisfaction, then you might not. Then you might want to change the design. So the security is one aspect of it, but the in many ways to deal with it is to ask the various questions about what could be different and how you'd react to them.
Okay. From another SDM alum, Keith Britton, who is with NASA and the Kennedy Space Center. NASA is currently reconfiguring its space launch facilities using an airport operations model. Traditionally, launch facilities were unique to launch vehicles. We are now trying to design facilities to accommodate multiple launch vehicle configurations with little consideration for aesthetics. What lessons can we learn from airport studies?
That's a very interesting, because I think, as you're suggesting, there is more and more sort of commercial launches, and whereas we may not be sort of space air transport very frequently, there certainly will be a lot more commercial launches in various places. So I guess I don't feel very comfortable trying to sort of say exactly what should be learned from it, but it seems like one should certainly consider the possibilities, as I guess people are. But I don't have a good answer to that. But thank you for a most interesting question. Give me something to think about.
From Edgar Jimenez.
Hola, Edgar.
There are some airport companies managing a large number of airports, for example, AENA, but they don't seem to have advanced a lot on standardization. So how can the gains in efficiency and cost effectiveness pass through the bureaucracy of large corporations, even if not owned by a government? And by the way, thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you, Edgar. I hope you're doing well. I think of you in Portugal. So it is clear, as you say, that AENA in Spain is not standardized and is not, as a government organization, been known for its rapid flexibility. But being a large company does not mean that you cannot have standardization. I mean, one of the keys for the success of FedEx, for example, and of, for that matter, of Southwest or Ryanair, is that they have, in fact, standardized. They use a common fleet, for example. They have common procedures and so forth, so that many companies can organize around this. I mean, the example is hotel chains that have got the art of preparing rooms and organizing things and training their personnel and all their computer support systems. They've got it down to a fine art. So I don't think that there is an inherent obstacle to efficiency in large corporations when the large corporations set themselves that as a goal. So that is a future that I would hope to see at some point.
Great. And our last question from, let's see, Joe Stanford. He says, unfortunately, I missed the first half, so maybe this was discussed already. Please forgive me if it was. Surely there must be a way to gain the efficiencies and other benefits of having an underlying standardized architecture while still leaving some room for aesthetically tailoring airports to local tastes, environments, traditions. So the question is, how could you encourage or enable ongoing diversity in aesthetics?
Well, I think that's, I don't think that the local initiatives need to be encouraged because it's pretty plain they're there. But I think that you're absolutely right that you could have a standardized basic structure about which you can do a lot to make it the airport reflect its local conditions. So that Portland, Oregon, for example, the airport has been known in the past for that characteristic, so that without being a super fancy architectural design, it features a lot of wood, which is a local product. It features local products in the stores. I mean, it makes a special airport, makes special effort to be a Portland airport. When you get there, you sort of know that you are in Portland because it has a character. On the other hand, in terms of its operations, it's fairly standard, as I understand it from the last time I was there. So I think that it isn't that difficult to put a local branding on something which is takes advantage of standardized elements.
Thank you. There's one more quick question which I can answer from Bolivar Dominguez. Sorry if I'm murdering your name. Is the presentation downloadable? The answer is it will be later this week, and everyone who has registered will be sent a link to the presentation and the recording, along with info on how to contact Professor de Neufville if you have further questions or anything you'd like to discuss, as well as another shameless promotion of the October 10th STM Systems Thinking Conference on Big Data. I'd like to express our appreciation to Professor de Neufville for yet another fantastic webinar, and to all of you for your wonderful questions and your interest in the webinar series in general. Have a wonderful day, and once again, you'll be sent a link later this week.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to meet you, as it were. Look forward to hearing from you later on.